I have learned the hard way that when a president reaches for emergency powers, the alarm rarely sounds the way people expect it to. There is no siren. There is no immediate suspension of the Constitution. What happens instead is quieter and far more dangerous. A declaration is made, often wrapped in legal language, justified as temporary, necessary, or even reluctant. And yet, inside government, everyone understands what it really signals, that normal political constraints are no longer doing the work they were designed to do. I've seen how emergency authority is supposed to function. It exists for moments when the machinery of government cannot move fast enough through ordinary channels. War, catastrophic attack, genuine national peril. But the American system was built on the assumption that emergencies are rare and bounded, and that presidents who invoke them would feel the weight of history pressing down on their judgment. When emergency powers are declared as a political maneuver rather than a last resort, the issue is not the text of the statute. It is the failure of restraint. What makes this moment especially revealing is not just the declaration itself, but the reaction it provokes. Republican pushback, when it comes, does not arrive as a unified defense of constitutional limits. It arrives fragmented, cautious, hedged with loyalty disclaimers. That hesitation tells you something essential. The alarm is sounding inside the system, but the people best positioned to respond are weighing institutional duty against political survival. That calculation is the stress fracture. Emergency powers do not erase Congress or the courts overnight. They test whether those institutions still believe in themselves. They ask whether lawmakers will defend authorities they have already surrendered in practice, and whether judges will intervene before normalization sets in. Most of all, they test whether the public still recognizes the difference between urgency and abuse. The danger here is not that democracy collapses in a single dramatic act. It is that the emergency becomes a governing style, a rhetorical shortcut, a way to bypass accountability while claiming necessity. By the time the public fully understands what has shifted, the declaration itself will feel less shocking than the silence that followed it. Emergency power did not begin as a political shortcut. It became one because we taught presidents that it could. After September 11, the country demanded speed, certainty, and protection, and our institutions responded by widening the executive's lane. Congress passed the authorization for use of military force in language so broad that it effectively outsourced war-making authority indefinitely. The Patriot Act collapsed distinctions between foreign threat and domestic life in the name of urgency. Each step was defended as temporary, exceptional, and necessary. Very few were ever meaningfully rolled back. From inside government, the shift felt pragmatic at first. Crises reward decisiveness, and presidents are structurally positioned to supply it. But what changed after September 11 was not just the scale of executive power. It was the cultural expectation that presidents should govern through exception. The normal process began to feel indulgent. The debate became delayed. Oversight became risk. And Congress, relieved of responsibility, learned that surrendering authority spared it accountability. The financial crisis of 2008 deepened this pattern. Faced with systemic collapse, administrations of both parties relied on emergency interventions that bypassed democratic consent in favor of technocratic necessity. Markets were stabilized, but a lesson was absorbed. When stakes are high enough, process is optional. That logic never returned to the bottle. It migrated from economic rescue to immigration enforcement, from national security to border politics, from genuine emergencies to manufactured ones. What emergency governance offers presidents is not just power, but narrative control. It reframes political conflict as an existential threat and casts dissent as irresponsibility. When invoked repeatedly, it trains the public to accept concentration of authority as competence. It also trains lawmakers to respond not with resistance, but with statements, letters, and symbolic objections that leave the underlying expansion intact. By the time a president declares emergency powers today, the legal architecture is already waiting. The precedents are already stacked. The tools are already normalized. What remains uncertain is not whether the declaration is lawful, but whether anyone still remembers that lawfulness was never meant to be the only standard. This is how emergency became a governing tool. not through a single power grab, but through bipartisan convenience, institutional fatigue, and the steady erosion of democratic muscle memory. By the time Republican resistance surfaced, the terrain had already shifted. That, more than anything, defines this moment. Objections came not as a unified assertion of congressional authority, but as a scatter of statements calibrated for risk. A press release here, a carefully worded concern there. Loyalty was affirmed before limits were mentioned. What looked, on the surface, like pushback was in practice a form of damage control. I've worked inside a Republican Party that once understood itself as a governing institution, not just a political vehicle. There were internal lines that mattered. There was a belief, sometimes imperfectly honored, that power required stewardship. What I see now is a party that recognizes the danger of emergency authority in the abstract, but lacks the internal cohesion or courage to confront it in real time. Resistance that arrives after the declaration is already a concession. The timing matters because emergency power feeds on delay. Once invoked, the burden shifts to opponents to prove harm rather than necessity. Lawmakers who hesitate in that window are not being cautious. They are allowing normalization to take root. The objections that come later are structurally weaker, legally narrower, and politically safer. They preserve individual reputations while leaving the precedent untouched. What makes this resistance especially hollow is that many of the same lawmakers raising concerns now help build the architecture that enables the declaration. They voted to expand executive discretion. They tolerated presidents of their own party testing boundaries. They learned to confuse partisan victory with institutional health. By the time the alarm sounded, their leverage was gone. This is not a story of hypocrisy alone. It is a story of dependency. A party that has organized itself around a single figure cannot suddenly rediscover institutional conscience without confronting its own complicity. Pushback that does not threaten consequences is not restraint, it is commentary. And so the resistance arrives too late, not because the danger is new, but because the habits that might have stopped it were abandoned years ago. Emergency power exposes that truth with brutal clarity. It shows us that when loyalty becomes the primary currency of politics, constitutional limits become optional, invoked only when they are no longer enforceable. One of the most misleading instincts in moments like this is to declare the system broken. It isn't. Not yet. The courts still issue rulings. Congress still gavels in and out. Federal agencies still function, still process paperwork, still enforce rules. That surface continuity is precisely what makes institutional strain so hard to recognize in real time. Democracies rarely announce their weakening. They carry on, under pressure, until the difference between function and integrity becomes impossible to ignore. Emergency power does not suspend institutions, it tests their confidence. Judges are asked not just whether a declaration fits within statutory authority, but whether they are willing to intervene early, before harm is fully visible. Legislators are asked whether they will reclaim powers they have long treated as theoretical. Career officials are asked whether adherence to the law is worth professional retaliation. None of these tests requires collapse to succeed. They only require hesitation. What I have seen again and again is how strain produces caution that masquerades as prudence. Courts move narrowly. Lawmakers defer. Agencies wait for guidance that never comes. Each individual choice is defensible. Collectively, they create a vacuum in which executive power expands by default. No one actor breaks the system. They simply fail to stop its bending. This is how institutional erosion avoids spectacle. There is no single ruling that ends accountability, no vote that dissolves democracy. Instead, there is a pattern of delayed intervention, incremental deference, and procedural comfort. Emergency governance thrives in that environment because it frames restraint as recklessness and action as responsibility. What makes this moment especially precarious is that the institutions under strain remember previous crises. They remember the political backlash, the threats, the accusations of overreach. That memory shapes behavior as much as law. Fear becomes a governing force, even when formal authority remains intact. So when we say the institutions are holding, we should be precise. They are operating, they are not yet asserting themselves. And the space between those two conditions is where democratic damage accumulates quietly, legally, and with the blessing of inaction. I say this as someone who now sits on the other side of the camera, but who spent years inside the system watching how power responds to coverage. The media does not just report crises anymore, it performs them. And in doing so, it often misses the gravity of what is actually at stake. Emergency declarations are treated as breaking news events rather than constitutional stress tests. The language is urgent, the graphics are red, the chyrons shout escalation, but the focus drifts quickly to reaction, to conflict, to who is up and who is down politically. What gets lost is the slow, structural story, the one about precedent, authority, and what becomes easier the next time a president reaches for extraordinary power. There is a market logic at work here. A crisis attracts attention. Conflict sustains it. The incentive is not to sit with institutional erosion, which unfolds over months and years, but to compress it into moments that can be debated and then replaced by the next outrage. In that environment, emergency governance becomes content rather than a condition, something to argue about, not something to stop. This is how normalization is accelerated. When declarations are framed as just another escalation in a familiar political drama, the public is trained to respond emotionally rather than civically. Viewers pick sides instead of asking structural questions. The story becomes whether the move will work, not whether it should exist at all. And once that framing takes hold, democratic accountability is already diluted. What worries me most is how often real constitutional danger is obscured by performative alarm. When everything is framed as unprecedented, nothing is treated as cumulative. The audience is exhausted by constant urgency, and fatigue sets in where vigilance should live. Emergency power thrives in that exhaustion. The media is not the villain here. It is part of the ecosystem. But when incentives reward spectacle over substance, the result is a public less equipped to recognize when democracy is being reshaped in plain sight, not with tanks or decrees, but with legal arguments, compliant silence, and wall-to-wall coverage that never quite explains what we're losing. What emergency governance ultimately relies on is not just institutional weakness, but public adaptation. Democracies do not fail when citizens panic. They fail when citizens adjust. When declarations that once would have triggered mass alarm are absorbed as just another headline, something fundamental has shifted in the civic bloodstream. I've watched this conditioning happen in stages. First comes disbelief, then outrage, then argument, and finally exhaustion. Each cycle leaves behind a residue of lowered expectations. What once felt intolerable becomes familiar. What once demanded accountability becomes a matter of preference or partisan interpretation. Over time, the public stops asking whether something is acceptable and starts asking whether it is inevitable. This is where emergency power does its quietest work. It reframes abnormal governance as realism. It teaches people that constitutional limits are luxuries for calmer times, that democracy must bend to survive, and that demanding restraint is naive in an age of constant threat. That message lands not because people are apathetic, but because they are overwhelmed. Fear and fatigue are powerful teachers. What makes this especially dangerous is that conditioning does not require agreement. People can oppose emergency declarations and still absorb their logic. They can dislike the actor and accept the tool. Once that separation occurs, the debate shifts from whether emergency power should exist to who should wield it. Democracy becomes a contest over control rather than a commitment to limits. This is how the unthinkable becomes discussable, then defensible, then routine. Each declaration lowers the psychological barrier for the next. Each moment of public resignation signals to those in power that the cost of escalation is manageable. Silence, even weary silence, is information. The tragedy is that this conditioning often feels rational in the moment. People are busy. They are struggling economically. They are saturated with crises, real and imagined. But democracy depends on a citizenry that can still recognize when governance by exception is becoming governance by habit. When the public adapts to emergency power, it does not mean democracy has ended. It means it has been placed on pause indefinitely and with no clear mechanism to restart it. Democratic restraint does not announce itself with speeches or slogans. It shows up as behavior, often unglamorous, often costly, almost always lonely. What this moment requires is not outrage, but discipline, the kind that institutions and individuals have practiced before and then slowly abandoned. Restraint begins with Congress remembering that authority seated in fear is rarely reclaimed without conflict. Emergency powers that persist beyond their justification are not neutral tools. They are invitations. Lawmakers who genuinely object cannot limit themselves to statements of concern. They must legislate limits, force votes, accept political consequences, and reassert the idea that necessity does not override consent. Anything less is performance. It requires courts willing to act before damage becomes irreversible. Judicial caution has its place, but democracy does not benefit when restraint is confused with retreat. Early intervention is not activism, it is preservation. The longer emergency governance proceeds unchecked, the more disruptive the correction becomes. Delay favors power. It also requires political parties to relearn the difference between loyalty and submission. Parties exist to organize governance, not to shield individuals from accountability. When internal dissent is treated as betrayal, restraint becomes impossible. A party that cannot police itself will eventually be policed by history. And it requires media to resist the easy lure of spectacle. Not every escalation deserves amplification. Not every declaration should be treated as a strategy. Some moments demand sustained explanation rather than constant reaction, a willingness to bore the audience slightly in order to inform them fully. Democracy is not optimized for clicks. Finally, it requires the public to reclaim a role that has been outsourced for too long. Citizenship is not a feeling, it is a practice. It involves attention, memory, and the refusal to accept that erosion is the price of stability. The most dangerous lie emergency power tells is that restraint is weakness. In reality, restraint is the proof that democracy still believes in itself. This moment does not ask whether the system will survive. It asks whether we will insist that it function as designed, not just in calm, but under stress. Emergency powers test the outer edge of democratic tolerance. What determines the outcome is not the declaration itself, but whether anyone still remembers where that edge is and is willing to hold it. That is the work of restraint. And it is never automatic.